The Imposter. It seems to me that there are some souls in this world to whom fortune is an unyielding companion, lavishing upon them all manner of happiness and ease, as if to assure that their lives be untroubled from the cradle to the grave. Such folk appear to float through their days unencumbered, as though some unseen hand were forever sweeping away obstacles from their path. I, however, am not of that kind. My own life, alas, has been one long succession of trials and vexations, as if the fates themselves had conspired to test my endurance at every turn. Where others find a smooth course, I encounter hindrances. Where others gain friends and support, I meet mistrust and misfortune. Indeed, at times I am compelled to wonder if I am not some minor character in the grand scheme of life, rather than the hero of my own tale. Yet to dwell upon such matters is to invite a heaviness of spirit that lingers like a shadow upon the soul, resisting all efforts to dispel it. And so I resign myself to the slow passage of time, which has been my only true companion on this tiresome journey eastward. If luck should ever deign to visit me, perhaps it will be upon my arrival in that distant and mysterious land of Transylvania, though I dare not place too much hope upon so fickle a prospect. In my travels I have discovered that there is much to be said for the mode of conveyance known as the train. Indeed, to glide along the rails with a sense of purpose, unburdened by the roughness of the road or the caprice of the elements, is a privilege unlike any other. How agreeable it is for those fortunate passengers who may move freely about the carriage, take their meals with ease, and partake in pleasant conversation, or, unlike within the confines of a coach, withdraw themselves as the mood strikes. Truly, it is the height of civilized travel, surpassing the hardships of sea voyage or the bumping discomfort of coach rides. Were I of sufficient means to secure my passage as a legitimate passenger, I should be content to travel exclusively by train from one end of the continent to the other. However, as my circumstances have dictated otherwise, I found myself rather cramped in the baggage car, which, I must admit, lacked all the luxuries of the carriages reserved for paying patrons. The journey was further made irksome by the vigilance of the train manager, who seemed most determined to inspect the baggage car at frequent intervals, no doubt suspecting the presence of a stowaway such as myself. Fortunately, as the hours passed, his diligence waned, and I was left to endure the remainder of my journey with a modicum of uneasy peace, nestled amongst the crates and trunks. It was after some time of gnawing hunger, a growling complaint from my stomach which could no longer be silenced, that I finally worked up the courage to leave the confines of the baggage car. The train manager, as Providence would have it, had indulged in a fair amount of drink, and his senses were suitably dulled to the extent that I could slip past him without much trouble. I made my way into the dining car where, to my good fortune, I found an empty seat among a group of finely dressed individuals. They were all bedecked in the sort of attire one might wear to an ambassador's reception, suits and dresses with lace and silk, all topped with an air of affected sophistication. Though my own garments were rather worse for wear, the group welcomed me, perhaps amused by the incongruity of my presence. The conversation at the table turned to the notion of moving from the west to the east, and I could not help but think how odd it was to speak of such distinctions. For in my travels I have always considered that if one proceeds far enough in any direction, he shall eventually find himself where he once began. The world, as I have observed, is round, and the idea of east or west is but a matter of perspective. They spoke of crossing rivers, the Danube in particular, and of Turkey, though curiously all of us were presently dining on chicken. When the waiter approached with more wine, I could not help myself and asked for some clarification. "Here is your wine, sir," said the waiter to the gentleman with a top hat and an exaggeratedly haughty demeanour, before he turned to me with considerably less ceremony. "It is a national dish, paprika hendel." It struck me that he had not addressed me as sir, though he had afforded that honour to my dinner companions. Though I felt somewhat slighted, I thought it wise not to bring attention to myself, considering my status as a stowaway. Nevertheless, the mention of paprika seemed to catch the interest of the table. "Paprika, you say?" asked the lady to my left, her voice tinged with fascination. "Why, I have heard of it, but I must say I have never tasted it before. Is it not an Eastern spice? How exotic!" The waiter nodded, his expression one of practised patience. "Yes, madam, it is indeed an Eastern spice, widely used in this region. It imparts a warm, distinctive flavour to many dishes. The chicken you are enjoying is prepared with a generous helping of paprika." "Oh, how marvellous!" exclaimed another gentleman, his monocle glinting as he leaned forward. "I must say, it has quite the effect, does it not? A most singular flavour. I feel positively transported to the Orient." The rest of the group murmured in agreement, raising their glasses of wine as if to toast the discovery of a new world of flavour. They spoke with enthusiasm of the spice, marvelling at its boldness and exotic allure, as if it were some rare treasure from a distant land. To me, however, it seemed a rather ordinary affair, merely a powder of red pepper, nothing more. As they continued their effusive praises, I could not help but think that this paprika, so highly regarded by my fellow diners, was simply a variation of pepper, dyed red perhaps by some obscure process that seemed unnecessarily laborious. The group grew increasingly thirsty as they indulged in the dish, and the waiter returned again and again with more wine. I began to suspect that this was the true benefit of the spice, its cunning artifice to compel an endless yet wholly justifiable thirst. They revelled in the experience, their faces flushed and animated. I watched in mild amusement, for I knew better. The spice, though pleasant enough, was hardly deserving of such veneration. It was but pepper, plain and simple, proof, perhaps, of how a touch of the unfamiliar can transform the mundane into the extraordinary, for those inclined to romanticize the exotic. As the conversation continued, I kept my observations to myself, content to enjoy my meal in silence while they carried on with their fantasies of the East. The train chuffed into Klausenburg with all the pomp of a storm passing through a deserted valley, rattling the windows, scattering the few folks loitering nearby, and filling the dim station with its own mighty importance. I disembarked with a certain sense of ceremony, though I quickly realized that I was indeed quite alone in this endeavour, not a soul to greet or guide me. The language of this place was foreign, either German or some near relative, though it sounded rather as if words were thrown against rocks, breaking apart and scattering. Unable to exchange words, I resorted to gestures and nods, trying to convey that I sought a place to rest. At length, an elderly gentleman, perhaps moved by my helpless pantomimes, pointed me to a narrow alley and made a shape in the air with his hands, suggesting a roof. I took it as an indication of an inn or some humble establishment. By this method of interpretive inquiry, I finally found my way to a modest abode tucked between two dilapidated buildings. It was no inn, but a boarding house of sorts, kept by a woman of indeterminate age whose speech was brisk as frost and movements just as chilly. I took her silence as agreement to my stay. Settled in, I set forth again, hoping to procure a map. My mission had not wandered from my mind. I sought the Castle Dracula, though its precise location remained elusive. By good fortune, or by a whim of destiny, I stumbled upon a vendor lamenting his lost goose. A gentleman of my disposition cannot abide by an uncompleted search, and so I tracked down the goose, who had taken residence under a lopsided cart. The vendor, in his gratitude, offered me a map in recompense. It was a quaintly drawn affair, full of winding roads, crude sketches of mountains, and indecipherable script. With no further ado, I set off to decipher it. My hopes in the map were, however, grossly misplaced. It seemed designed for an audience already familiar with the terrain, a rather presumptuous assumption for a traveller. Roads wound themselves into a frenzy of loops, and the castle's exact placement appeared to have been swallowed by a drawn mountain or misshapen cloud. Nevertheless, my spirits remained undaunted, for I had found the goose, and thus took it as a sign of my competence in matters of discovery. Therefore, the castle's continued illusion was due to the inferior cartographic practices of Klausenburg. The night approached, and I found myself without lodging due to a misunderstanding of the nature and indeterminate age of my prior host. I wandered to a small park dotted with benches, where the resident wanderers and destitute greeted me with a wary eye. The trials of the day had left me looking sufficiently bedraggled, it seemed, as they allowed me to join them without much fuss. They were a curious sort, a blend of old soldiers, tramps, and itinerant fortune-tellers who spoke in riddles. We played games of chance with stray pebbles and bits of broken glass, a ritual of sorts that gained me their tentative approval. With the rite completed, I took my seat among them, and my fatigue soon gave way to dreams. Yet sleep did not bring peace. Instead, I found myself haunted by visions of shadowy forms and hollow-eyed wolves, their howls piercing the silence. Odd scents wafted through my mind. the rich musk of the forest and, oddly enough, pepper tainted with a reddish hue. The locals had indeed insisted upon seasoning every dish with this crimson spice, which lent even the simplest meal a fiery quality. Whether it was the spice or some lingering miasma from the landscape I cannot say, but I awoke with a distinct sense of apprehension. My awakening was less gentle than I would have preferred, as a persistent tugging upon my foot roused me. A scruffy dog had latched onto my shoe with what could only be described as earnest hunger. He might have thought me a corpse left on the bench ripe for picking. With some effort and a few words which could not be understood, yet which I'm certain conveyed my displeasure, I shooed him off, threatening to shoe him indeed if he did not depart. The morning air was thick with mist, and the sun was a pale disk attempting to penetrate the clouds, casting the streets in a dreary half-light. The locals resumed their routines, barely glancing at the lone foreigner, who no doubt looked as if he belonged to the ranks of those that drifted through Klausenberg's murky streets. In need of sustenance, I returned to the boarding-house, where my hostess, with a glint of charity, or perhaps a desire to see me move along, provided a breakfast. It was a coarse mixture consisting of maize porridge called mammaliga, topped with a substantial dusting of the infamous red pepper. She watched with what I perceived as faint amusement as I struggled to conceal my dismay over the pepper's potency, which seemed designed to ward off all but the stoutest of travellers. With the morning hours slipping by, I sought advice from the locals, once more relying upon a series of hand gestures and improvised signs, attempting to ascertain the location of Castle Dracula. This time, a young man who seemed to possess some knowledge of English squinted at me, tilting his head. "Ah, Castello," he muttered, nodding as if piecing together some long-lost fragment of memory. He spoke to me in rapid bursts of words, of which I caught little but the apparent conclusion that the castle lay quite a distance off. It seemed I was no closer to my goal than when I'd first arrived. Another train was required, I gathered. With a certain resignation, I resigned myself to the railway once more. The train's lateness, while an inconvenience to most, proved a boon for my own designs. For had it arrived promptly, I would surely have missed my chance to board without coin or ticket. I waited patiently, loitering near a stack of luggage as if deeply absorbed in some study of the fine details upon each trunk, until the guard turned his back. Then, with a swiftness I did not know myself to possess, I slipped into the carriage and took a seat behind a stack of crates, feeling quite accomplished in my stealth. As the train rumbled to life and lurched forward, I imagined watching the countryside unspool like a painted scroll. We passed quaint towns, their roofs rising like curious hats over hillsides, and streams that sparkled with a clarity only found in places untroubled by industry. Yet, as the sun dipped and darkness stretched its fingers across the land, a curious melancholy overtook me. It felt somehow dishonest to continue imagining these sights once twilight had stolen them from the view of the honest, paying occupants. Thus, I resigned myself to the shadows, humbled and chastened, my imagination stilled by the solemnity of night. Awakening before our train reached Bistritz, I found myself possessed of an idle curiosity. Glancing about the compartment, I noted a collection of unattended luggage, each piece jostling along with the train's rhythmic rumble. Seeing little harm in exploration and feeling in some small way, like a natural philosopher surveying foreign artifacts, I set upon examining the nearest bag. Inside, I unearthed a small, worn encyclopedia, its leather cover creased with age. Turning to the section on Bistritz, I absorbed a number of interesting and troubling details about this destination of mine. Apparently, Bistritz had endured a rather harrowing existence, marked by an astounding frequency of fires. Whether it was a series of 5 incidents, or one continuous inferno over time, the text was unclear. Additionally, famine and disease were not merely the infrequent visitations of misfortune, but seemed to hold a regular and tyrannical sway over the populace. Here, I thought, was a town worn thin by the unyielding hand of fate. When at last the train ground to a halt at the station, I seized upon the opportunity to disembark swiftly, carrying with me the newfound luggage, for the encyclopedia had proven useful enough to justify its acquisition. Bistritz lay spread before me, a town of narrow cobbled streets and ancient buildings whose timbers groaned under the weight of centuries. It was charming, I supposed, in the way a preserved ruin might be charming to a passing tourist, though I could not imagine dwelling here any longer than necessary. The very air bore a faint scent of smouldering, as though the town's history of fires had seeped into the stones themselves, an indelible reminder of past tribulations, one that I could not, no matter my attempts, escape. I wandered toward the centre of town, gesturing and nodding my way through interactions with the locals, hoping to secure lodging. Their dialect was indecipherable to me, but through a series of intricate mimes, I was eventually directed to an establishment known as the Golden Crone Hotel. The name struck me as slightly grandiose, yet appealing. Here was a place aspiring toward greatness, an ambition I felt aligned well with my own. A sign, I thought, for its aspirations mirrored my desires. The innkeeper, a cheery-looking elderly woman dressed in the traditional garb of the region, with a white undergarment and a snugly fitted double apron of colourful cloth, welcomed me with a deep bow. Her attire, though somewhat immodestly tight for a woman of her years, did not seem to cause her any embarrassment. Though I arduously suppressed my curiosity, I neither commented on nor inquired about her age, inclinations, or proclivities. I was, after all, grateful to have found lodging, and the alternative of passing another night as a presumed corpse on a park bench, harassed by stray mongrels, did not appeal. To my surprise, the woman spoke a rudimentary form of English, enough so that my gestures were returned to extrinsicness and were no longer completely necessary. She approached me with a curious expression and in a high crackling voice inquired, "The Herr Englishman?" Though I am neither English nor particularly suited to titles of formality, and could not fathom how she could mistakenly believe I was a rabbit, I pretended for want of lodging. "Yes," I replied, hoping to avoid any further questioning that might reveal my deception. The woman seemed satisfied and accepted my response with a nod, and I was shown to a modest room. That evening at supper, I joined the other guests, savouring, or rather enduring, a dish that was again liberally spiced with the local paprika, a seasoning so ubiquitous it seemed to underpin their entire culinary tradition. Perhaps their taste buds had grown resilient to its fiery qualities. Mine, however, were left in a state of numb alarm. Seizing upon the chance for conversation, I inquired among the locals about my intended destination, Castle Dracula. The mention of it cast a palpable shadow over the group, and several guests made the sign of the cross, muttering in their own language. They professed ignorance, yet their averted eyes and nervous glances conveyed a deeper understanding, one they dared not voice. It was all rather unsettling, and though I pressed, they offered no further information. That night I resolved to pursue the matter with a more direct approach. Through means that might appear unsavoury in finer company, though entirely necessary under the circumstances, I gleaned a crucial piece of intelligence. A local drunkard, whose faculties were questionable but whose experience seemed genuine, informed me in a low whisper that to reach Castle Dracula I would need to take the Borgo Pass. He leaned in closer, his breath heavy with gin, and offered a strange warning. "No need to find the castle," he slurred, his eyes glassy. "The castle will find you." I dismissed this as the fanciful rambling of a man too deeply acquainted with spirits of a different nature, yet it left a faint chill in my mind. As the last of his gin disappeared, I bade him well, pocketing the map he'd sketched on a crumpled napkin, and departing with a mix of hope, trepidation, and well wishes. The following morning, I found myself once again in possession of little but a newfound resolve and a few scraps of information. The night, in its capricious way, relieved me of my newly acquired luggage, thus returning me to my habitual state of austerity. This, too, I considered a blessing of sorts, for I was as yet unaccustomed to the burden of exuberance, and could once more proceed unencumbered, with my conscience lightened by the return to familiar simplicity. Yet this misfortune was not without its slight recompense or without purpose, for I managed, through a series of modest trades, to secure a one-way fare on a coach bound for the dreaded Borgo Pass. The morning had scarcely settled when my host barged into my room, her face painted with a hysteria that I found rather unsettling for the hour. "Must you go? Oh, young Herr, must you go?" she exclaimed, her voice carrying a thickened accent that was almost indecipherable in the early haze of dawn. I rubbed my eyes and took a moment to comprehend her question. "Yes," I replied firmly, "I must go." Her face twisted into a look of both pity and concern. She took a deep breath, then asked again, "Do you know what day it is?" "March 16th, I replied, somewhat puzzled by her emphasis. I knew the date well, for it was well intertwined with my intention, being the eve of the day that had drawn me to this peculiar corner of the world. I was under the impression that the date was a quiet mark of personal significance, at least in this part of the world, but it appeared the townsfolk had assigned it a public reverence of their own. I supposed it must be another excuse for these superstitious folk to drink and drive off imaginary spectres, or perhaps to chase snakes in some village ceremony. The rural inclination towards such rituals struck me as excessively idolatrous. The woman herself wore a crucifix round her neck, and I noticed many more adorning the walls of the room in various sizes and shapes, as if to create a veritable barrier of holy metal. Then, with trembling hands, she removed the crucifix from around her own neck and offered it to me. I confess I was at a loss as to how I ought to proceed. As an Englishman and a staunch member of the Church, I had been taught to regard such icons with a degree of idolatrous, if not outright disdain. Yet, seeing the tear-streaked lines on her face and the trembling earnestness with which she presented the crucifix, I felt it would be exceedingly rude, perhaps even ungrateful, to refuse. She seemed to read the reluctance in my expression, for without a word she stepped closer and placed the crucifix around my neck herself. "For your mother's sake," she whispered, a quiet plea that held a power of its own. She then turned and left the room without further ado. I took a moment to gather a few belongings, which were humble enough to go unnoticed, and made my way out to meet the coach. Alas, it was late in arriving, and I found myself engaged in that dreaded pastime of waiting. My lack of sleep from the previous night weighed heavily upon me, and I felt a dull yearning for the comfort of a bed. My mind lingered stubbornly upon the precious hours of sleep robbed from me by my early rising, a theft which, with each protracted moment of waiting, grew in grievance and seemed a greater theft. Seeking to distract myself, I wandered over to a modest cafe and dined on a local specialty known as robber steak. My curiosity was piqued when I observed a foreign gentleman, foreign to this land, dining near me. He seemed well prepared, as his meal was accompanied by a dictionary which he perused frequently, presumably to aid his communication with the staff. Watching the steak diminish with each bite stirred something within me, and without pausing to consider the imprudence of the act, I leapt at the opportunity. My hand darted forward, and before he could protest I had absconded with both his steak and his dictionary, slipping into the crowd and taking shelter in the anonymity of the busy square. With my purloined breakfast quickly devoured, I returned to the coach stop to find that the coach had finally arrived. The driver, however, was not in his seat. Instead, he stood in deep conversation with the landlady, who cast frequent glances in my direction. Their faces bore expressions that were, to say the least, disconcerting. As they spoke, others gathered around, whispering amongst themselves and throwing me glances that were tinged with pity and perhaps even a hint of fear. Their voices, though muffled, repeated certain words with an insistence that aroused my curiosity. I strained to listen, catching snatches of foreign sounds that seemed oddly familiar. With a jolt I recalled the brief study I had conducted through the local encyclopedia, and now, with the aid of my newly acquired polyglot dictionary, I was able to make some sense of the conversation. To my dismay, the words I discerned were far from comforting. Ordog, Satan, Pokol, Hell, Stragoica, Witch, and Vrolok and Vilkoslak, both of which, I learned, were terms used to describe either werewolves or vampires, depending upon the dialect in question. I shook my head at the absurdity of it all. These superstitions seemed nothing more than the remnants of an old and unenlightened world, clung to by a people who preferred charms and whispers to reason. They cast furtive glances at me, some tracing strange symbols in the air, others muttering what I could only assume were defences meant to ward off evil or curses meant to hasten it. At length, I was joined by 3 other passengers, all of whom seemed equally disconcerted by the whispers around us. There was no time for introductions, however, for just then the driver returned, climbing into his seat and taking up the reins with a sudden vigour. With a resounding crack of his whip, the coach lurched forward. The horses, a quartet of small, hardy beasts, trotting in unison as we set off on our journey toward the Borgo Pass. The road beneath us was excellent, and we raced along it with such speed that I was pressed back in my seat, clutching the side of the carriage for balance. The driver, who bore a stern, implacable expression, had set himself upon a feverish pace, urging the horses onward. I knew not why we moved with such haste, yet it seemed he had a determined purpose in mind, for his whip cracked with a frequency and fervour that made the horses strain as though they too understood we had no time to lose. Before us the landscape unfurled like a tapestry, a rolling sea of green hills dotted with dense clusters of trees, and the occasional farmhouse standing solitary, its blank windowless gable turned toward the road. The orchards were in early bloom, and as we passed through them, I saw the soft carpets of fallen petals scattered beneath the trees, a froth of pinks and whites that gave the scene a dreamlike quality. The air itself seemed perfumed with the mingling scents of apple, plum, cherry, and pear blossoms, all of which would have made for a serene journey had it not been for the relentless speed of our progress. My fellow travellers, all three of them bundled in thick woolen garments, engaged in the usual pleasantries common to strangers on such journeys. They asked each other the customary questions, where one was from, why another travelled, but I knew well enough that such inquiries served merely as a balm against the silence. People I had observed seemed to require a distraction from their own thoughts, as though quiet reflection were a burden too great to bear alone, it somehow being alleviated by sharing the pain amongst others, and so, like crickets in the evening, they chirped along with trivialities to fill the air. The conversation turned amiable enough until I, in a moment of genuine curiosity, inquired about Dracula and the location of his castle. No sooner had the words left my mouth than a dreadful silence fell upon the group, each traveller withdrawing into themselves as though I had uttered some unspeakable curse. I was left to sit in the chilly silence, a feeling of awkward isolation settling over me. As the silence grew unbearable, I found myself wistfully recalling the trains of my yesterdays, even if they did reek of that dreadful paprika. As the road twisted and turned, and the sun dipped low behind us, the shadows crept slowly along the ground, enveloping us in the dusky glow of evening. Crosses lined the roadside at frequent intervals, tall weathered monuments leaning toward the road as though they too bore witness to our journey. Each time we passed one, my fellow passengers made the sign of the cross, their faces set in solemn concentration. Now and then we would pass a lone peasant, kneeling by a small shrine, lost in silent devotion, heedless of our passing. It seemed as though they were in a state of self-surrender so deep that neither the rumble of wheels nor the crack of the driver's whip could stir them from their prayers. When night finally overtook us, a peculiar agitation seized my companions. They muttered to the driver in hurried whispers, their eyes wide with what I could only assume was fear. The driver, in response, took up his whip with renewed vigour, lashing the horses until foam gathered at their flanks. He called out to them with strange cries, urging them to even greater speeds, and we flew onward through the thickening darkness. During this tense interval, I attempted once more to glean some knowledge of Dracula's castle. I pressed them for directions, hoping they might loosen their tongues in light of the impending night. Yet each mention of the name Dracula was met with a renewed urgency to silence me. They shushed and scowled, their hands fluttering about in superstitious gestures that hinted at some deeply ingrained fear, as though even speaking the name might bring a curse upon us. At length one of them declared in a voice trembling with emotion that they would prefer to carry me past that place entirely, were it not for my insistence on reaching it. This continued until the driver, in a fit of apparent frustration, stopped the coach to light his lanterns. With his passengers aiding him, he then proceeded, without a word, to pull me from the carriage. I found myself, quite unceremoniously, left by the roadside as the coach rattled away, the glow of its lamps fading swiftly into the night. Left alone, I surveyed my surroundings, the silence punctuated only by the distant howl of a wolf. I thought, perhaps, that it might be a werewolf, but dismissed the notion as fanciful. Yet before I could dwell too long upon this unsettling isolation, or rampant thoughts left purchase on my resolve, a glimmer of a light appeared on the road behind me. Through the mist I discerned a carriage, a calash to be precise, pulled by 4 magnificent black horses, their coats gleaming like polished obsidian in the faint moonlight. The vehicle swept past with eerie silence, then slowed to a stop beside me. I could just make out the figure of the driver, a tall man, taller than I expected, cloaked in black, his face shadowed beneath the brim of an imposing hat. In the faint light of his own lantern, I caught a flash of his eyes, bright and unnervingly intense, with a strange reddish hue that seemed to glow in the dimness. He regarded me without a word, as though appraising my worth, or perhaps my courage. For a moment, we simply stood there in mutual silence, he upon his lofty perch and I in the dust of the roadside. There was an unspoken invitation in his gaze, a beckoning that felt both sinister and irresistible. "You seek Count Dracula?" he inquired, his voice low and resonant. Before I could muster a reply or a question, he gestured with a slight inclination of his head toward the open door of the calash, inviting me to enter. I nodded in cautious assent, casting a wary glance toward the darkening forest, where the distant howls drew ever closer. With a mixture of trepidation and curiosity, I stepped inside, settling into the dark, velvety interior. The driver gave a low command, and the horses resumed their pace, pulling us deeper into the darkness with a swiftness that rivaled the coach that had abandoned me. Through the dim light filtering from the carriage lamps, I could faintly discern the outline of the calash driver. My gaze, seemingly unnoticed at first, soon caught his attention, for he turned slightly and addressed me in a curious halting English. "The night is chill, mein Herr," he said, his words stretched and oddly accented, "and my master, the Count, bade me take all care of you. There is a flask of Slivovitz underneath the seat if you should require it." I could hardly refuse such an offer, and, reaching beneath the seat, found the flask and took a long, warming draught. The plum brandy, rough and fiery, staved off the chill of the night air as we travelled through a landscape that grew steadily stranger. We moved at a vigorous pace, the horses trotting as if they were on an urgent errand, though our path, curiously, was not a direct one. We would charge forward in a straight line, only to take a sharp turn and proceed in another straight line, forming what I eventually recognised as a sort of squared circuit. Though I couldn't be entirely certain, I had a strong suspicion that we were moving in circles, though technically squares as the roads curved a little, a tactic that seemed designed to delay my arrival. I sensed the driver's game, to bide his time, to stretch the journey, and perhaps incite some logical grievance from me. I resolved, however, to frustrate his efforts by remaining patient, enduring the continual squaring with a quiet and calm forbearance. Midnight, I supposed, must be drawing near. The driver's delays, biding time till the day proper, gave me ample time for private rehearsal, so I occupied myself by imagining various conversations with my future host, preparing clever rejoinders and subtle queries so that, whatever turn our discussions might take, I would have an answer at hand. Such forethought, I reasoned, would spare me from the regrettable affliction of l'esprit de l'escalier, an ailment too familiar to the clever unprepared. Just as I settled into my contemplations, a mournful howl broke the silence, a deep, tormented wail that seemed to shiver with fear. Another soon joined it, and then another, until the night was filled with an eerie chorus of dogs howling, their cries mingling with the more sinister howls of wolves. Werewolves, perhaps, for the full moon loomed large above us. I could not claim to know the exact peculiarities of a werewolf, having had limited encounters with such creatures, though I knew they thrived in regions steeped in superstition. Or, depending on the regional translation, it may have been the voices of a gathering of vampires, perhaps howling about the night as they are surely wont to do. All was, of course, mere conjecture, for those ominous howls might well have sprung from banshees lingering just beyond my periphery. We soon entered a dense wood, the trees pressing close on either side until their branches arched above us, forming a natural tunnel through which we passed as though descending into some underground passage. Now and then towering rocks loomed on either side, their rugged faces frowning down as if they held some primal grievance against the world. Although sheltered by the trees, I could still hear the rising wind, its moan echoing through the rocks and rattling the branches overhead. The dogs' howling faded as we pressed onward, but the wolves sounded ever nearer, as though closing round from every side. Throughout this disquieting journey, the driver remained unperturbed, his head turned occasionally, glancing left and right, as though seeking something in the shadows, though his expression revealed nothing. I entertained the notion that his endless squaring of the route had perhaps left him disoriented. Then, without warning, a faint flickering light appeared to our left, a blue flame that seemed to dance upon the air. The driver noticed it at the same moment, and with a sharp tug on the reins, he brought the carriage to an abrupt halt. Leaping to the ground, he vanished into the darkness, leaving me alone to ponder the nature of this ghostly illumination. A blue flame! I thought it strange, for I might have expected red, a hue more suited for the matter at hand and far more reasonable. My musings were interrupted by the driver's sudden reappearance. He climbed back into his seat without a word, and we resumed our journey as though nothing had occurred, momentarily at least, for the incident repeated itself multiple times. Each time a blue flame flickered into view, the driver would stop, dismount, and disappear into the shadows, only to return moments later and continue as though it were the most natural occurrence in the world. Once the flame appeared so near the road that even through the surrounding darkness I could discern the driver's motions. He moved swiftly to the spot where the flame danced, gathering a few stones and arranging them in some cryptic pattern upon the ground. The flame, strangely, cast no light upon the surrounding area. Its glow illuminated nothing but itself. I observed, with no small astonishment, that when the driver passed between me and the flame, his figure did not obscure it, and I could see its flicker through his form as though he were a mere shadow. It was indeed a marvel, but I reasoned that the darkness concealed many things, and there should exist things hovering just beyond the reach of ordinary sight that one does not see, but still knows is there, like a rainbow in the dark. The driver's apparent familiarity with such phenomena seemed, in its way, perfectly natural, reasonable even. But too while waiting, I reflected upon and understood why, in this land, perpetual lateness was a common practice, with everyone getting sidetracked with ease. Far from being troubled, I found the delays intriguing, a boon, for there lied ample opportunity in each delay. A golden opportunity I intended to take. Though the frequent halts wore upon my patience and the lack of sleep tugged insistently at my eyelids, I found myself drifting into a half-sleep, lulled by the distant chorus of howls that floated through the night air. My trust in the driver's sense of direction, misplaced as it may have been, allowed me this fragile rest. Yet it was a fitful sort of slumber, punctuated by jolts each time we stopped, or when the driver lingered for reasons unknown, forcing me awake before I could sink fully into oblivion. Time stretched endlessly, the moments blurring together as we pressed onward in nearly total darkness, for the clouds had swallowed up the moon, casting us into an all-encompassing gloom. The road grew steeper as we climbed, with rare descents, but our general path was an ascent that left me wondering if we aimed to reach the very peak of Transylvania itself. Then, without warning, I became aware of the slowing horses, the driver pulling up the reins, and I roused myself fully, peering through the carriage window. Before us lay the courtyard of a vast, ruined castle, silhouetted against the night sky, its tall, black windows as empty and lifeless as the hollow eyes of a skull. No light shone from within. The broken battlements etched a jagged, uneven line against the murky moonlight that filtered through gaps in the clouds. I could not yet see the courtyard in its entirety, but even in the dimness, it appeared to be of considerable size, its space exaggerated by the dark archways leading off in various directions. When the calash came to a halt, the driver sprang from his seat with an agility that belied his seemingly sombre manner, and he extended his hand to assist me. His grip was astonishingly firm, cold and unyielding, as if made of iron rather than flesh. To my surprise, now standing at his full height, he seemed taller than I had first observed, towering over me with an unexpected air of menace. Having brought no luggage, I was spared the task of retrieving any belongings, though I had anticipated this moment and prepared a small offering for the driver. I had taken the liberty of tearing several pages from my dictionary, folding them to resemble currency in the faint light. Without hesitation, I handed him these notes with a word of thanks, hoping the dimness would conceal my improvised fare. I found myself standing before an immense wooden door, heavily studded with iron nails and set within a thick, venerable stone archway. Even in the dim light, I could see that the stone bore carvings, though they had been worn by the relentless touch of time and weather, their original details softened into obscure shapes. As I examined the doorway, the driver climbed back into his seat, and, with a flick of the reins, sent the horses forward, the entire trap vanishing into one of the dark archways without a backward glance, leaving me alone in the cold, silent courtyard. Moments passed, and then I heard a slow, ponderous footfall approaching from behind the door. Through the narrow cracks in the wood, a faint light flickered, drawing nearer with each step. The rattling of chains and the scrape of massive bolts reached my ears, followed by the harsh sound of an old key turning in a lock that had long resisted such movement. With a heavy groan, the great door swung open, revealing an elderly man, tall and thin, with a clean-shaven face except for a long, drooping white moustache. He was clad entirely in black, devoid of any colour, as though he had stepped from the shadow of the night itself. He held an ornate, valuable-looking silver lamp, its flame burning strangely without a glass chimney, casting quivering shadows that danced along the stone walls in the draught of the open door. He raised his right hand with a courtly gesture, motioning for me to enter. He was noticeably out of breath, as though he had traversed some great distance with uncommon haste, and a laboured moment passed before he regained sufficient command over himself to speak. "Welcome to my house. Enter freely and of your own will," he said, his English flawless, yet tinged with a peculiar cadence, as though it had travelled far to reach his lips. He did not move to meet me, but remained motionless, his gesture fixed in a manner that lent him the appearance of a statue, his form as still and cold as the stone that surrounded us. I sensed that he had made a grave error in inviting me in so freely, a lesson, I thought, that he would soon come to regret. No sooner had I stepped over the threshold than he advanced with unexpected swiftness, seizing my hand in a firm grip that made me wince. His touch was icy, his fingers as rigid and lifeless as the stones upon which I stood. "Welcome to my house. Come freely, go safely, and leave something of the happiness you bring," he repeated, his words laced with an unnerving formality. There was a strength in his grasp that felt unsettlingly familiar, reminding me of the clash driver's steely hold. "Count Dracula?" I asked, with a tone that implied both curiosity and wariness. He bowed slightly, his expression unreadable, and replied, "I am Dracula, and I bid you welcome to my house. Come in. The night air is chill, and you must need to eat and rest." The Count stood aside, gesturing for me to proceed further into the dim interior. There was an aura of expectancy about him, a silent command woven into his courteous invitation. Fatigued and famished as I was, I had a purpose to fulfil, though I felt it prudent to delay the true nature of my visit until I had supped. Business conducted on an empty stomach rarely turns out well, and, given the unseemly nature of my intentions, I thought it wise to cushion my request with the comforts of a well-prepared meal. "You will need, after your journey, to refresh yourself by making your toilet," Count Dracula said, his tone polite but firm. "I trust you will find all you wish. When you're ready, come into the other room, where you will find your supper prepared. I pray you be seated and sup how you please. You will, I trust, excuse me that I do not join you, but I have dined already, and I do not sup." "Of course not," I replied, attempting levity. "What's up with that? Just a jest. But yes, I'll attend to my toilet, and then sup." When I returned, I found that the Count himself had come forward to remove the cover from a dish, revealing an excellent roast chicken. Wasting no time, I fell upon it with great satisfaction, savouring each bite. The chicken was accompanied by cheese, salad, and a bottle of Old Tokay, of which I indulged in 2 generous glasses. To my great relief, the meal was devoid of paprika, a seasoning which, after the last few days, I hoped never to encounter again. As I ate, the Count peppered me with questions regarding my journey. I answered him readily enough, embellishing here and there for effect and discreetly omitting certain digressions, all while keeping my true intentions veiled. Once I'd polished off the last morsels, the Count leaned forward, his gaze piercing, and asked, "Tell me, why have you gone so far out of your way to find me?" I decided that honesty, or a version of it, was, in this case, the best policy. Clearing my throat, I replied, "Good, good. Now, listen, Count. I don't want to waste your time circling around the matter, or squaring it, as it were, for that matter. Here's the deal. Today is St. Patrick's Day. I've caught you, so let's not beat about the bush. Hand over the gold, and I'll be on my way. Not all of it, mind you. I'm not that cold-hearted, but enough to make this journey fiscally justifiable. A substantial sum, you understand. We are in the middle of nowhere, after all. Frankly, I'm half convinced this castle doesn't even exist. It's certainly not on any of the maps I've perused. Taxes can't be that bad, and the fee of the driver can't be that exorbitant," I added pointedly. The Count's expression transformed from bemusement to one of nearly blank incomprehension. He looked genuinely baffled. "Nay, sir, I do not understand your meaning." I sighed, gesturing broadly to perhaps aid his understanding. "Do I need to physically capture you to satisfy the custom? Is that it? Do I wait till daylight and actually follow the rainbow? Or is this going to be one of those I have no gold axe? I mean, the castle's not doing great, it's probably a lot of upkeep." But I was there, Count, and we stopped a lot, the driver and me, enough to guess there's no shortage of wealth in this venture. So let's not dally, there's plenty of gold for us to split. The warmth of his earlier hospitality seemed to dissipate entirely, replaced by a silent chill. I observed his reaction keenly, aware that his apparent confusion was not entirely unexpected. I had prepared myself for resistance. At last, with a glimmer of understanding, he said slowly, "You're under the impression that I am a vamp." "Leprechaun? Yes, I do," I cut him off, remembering the speech I'd rehearsed in my mind. "And let me clarify," I continued. "I appreciate the difficulty you've gone to in concealing yourself. A grand hiding place indeed, very lair-like, nowhere close to Ireland. But honestly, the signs are obvious. The compulsive counting habit, undoubtedly you're drawn to it by some force of nature, like counting gold. I dare say if I threw a sack of grain on the floor, you'd feel obliged to tally each and every seed. The hat, your driver's hat, I mean, the beard, the coat, the general aura of mischief, especially once caught, it all fits. You're a touch taller than the usual description, true, and the lack of red is noticeable, but I suppose subtlety was your aim here. Besides, Mendel's work explains variations well enough to account for your height." The Count stared at me, his face a mask of incredulity as I laid out my logic. I could sense a battle within him, a clash between disbelief and, dare I say it, an uneasy recognition. Perhaps no one had dared to see him thusly before, but there I sat, resolute and certain in my claim, waiting for him to see reason, and settle this matter in the manner he no doubt preferred. The Count's face was one of striking severity, an aquiline profile with a high-bridged thin nose and nostrils arched in a peculiarly sinister fashion. His forehead was lofty and domed, his hair receding at the temples yet stubbornly thick and unruly elsewhere. Massive eyebrows nearly met over his nose, forming a dense, bushy ridge that seemed to curl and coil of its own accord. Beneath a heavy moustache lay a mouth that appeared rather cruel, the thin lips parted just enough to reveal peculiarly sharp, white teeth that protruded over his ruddy lips with a vitality uncanny for a man of his years. His pointed ears and broad angular chin lent him a countenance of both pallor and severity. "Listen," I said, waving my hands to emphasize my point. "I don't see a mirror anywhere, but if there was one, you'd see what I mean. You'd look at yourself and say, 'Look, a leprechaun.'" Dracula's brows furrowed, his face a strange mask of displeasure. "I can assure you," he replied icily, "I am in no way a leprechaun. In fact, no one who has ever been in my presence has mistaken me for one. You have made a grave and terrible mistake, one that you shall pay dearly for I am Count Dracula, master of the night, lord of the undead, sovereign among vampires. The very darkness bends to my will, and mortals tremble at my name." "Yeah, nice try," I scoffed, crossing my arms. "That's what the genie said too." Dracula's face contorted in confusion. "Wait, what?" he stammered. "You think I haven't seen these tricks before? It's not going to work on me." "Not going to happen," I replied, casually glancing around the room, looking for valuable items that I could bear the weight of, noting a few candlesticks and a rather ancient-looking chalice that might be worth the trouble of taking along. "The genie said he wasn't a leprechaun?" Dracula asked, visibly thrown off. "Yes." "Well, no," I clarified. "I never actually said the genie was a leprechaun. When I accused him of being a genie, he tried to play it off, saying he was a vampire instead. Didn't trust him, of course. Had to teach him a lesson. It's a long story. Anyway, I got 3 wishes out of the deal. Naturally, I wished for gold, but he was still a little sour about, well, getting discovered and getting kicked in the nards, so he twisted my wish. And instead of gold, I ended up having to go on this adventure." Dracula leaned forward and declared, "But I am truly a vampire, an immortal creature of the night, and all who cross my path shall know the fear of eternal darkness." "Sure, but look, it's late, and I'd rather get on with it." Dracula, looking increasingly bewildered but strangely curious, asked, What were your other 2 wishes? If you must know, I replied, immortality and fame, but don't worry about it. Dracula's brow furrowed further, scepticism plain on his face. Well, I've certainly never heard of you, he said. It's a process, I replied with a shrug. I mean, I just got the wishes 3 days ago. Well, 4 now. Give it time, my friend, give it time. One doesn't simply become a famous monster hunter overnight. But anyway, here's the deal. I'm taking some of your stuff. Not all of it. Just some things I can carry. And I'll be taking your coach because, frankly, I need a way back. I'm going to take, I don't know, just some stuff, a few trinkets. You probably won't even notice they're gone. But I'm going to have to also break some stuff because, you didn't fulfill your part of the deal. I mean, you haven't exactly been forthright. But here's the good news. I'm giving you a year. A whole year to get my gold. A potful, the standard amount, whatever that is. And there is one last thing. The Count's face contorted in fury, his eyes blazing. How dare you enter my home and make demands of me? I am the great Count Dracula, and you are nothing but a fool. And I also have to teach you a lesson, I said, delivering a swift kick to his unlucky charms. Dracula doubled over, his face twisted in agony, his once grand posture reduced to writing on the floor. Unable to move, he could only watch helplessly as I strolled about the room, loading the calash with various expensive-looking trinkets, cutlery, and aged relics, and, seeing the Count begin to stir, I renewed my assault upon his person until he at last surrendered his struggle, collapsing in a silent, unmoving heap upon the floor. I thought it unlikely he'd manage to gather the gold within the allotted year. Leprechauns, in my experience, were notoriously bad with finances, but I considered my terms charitable, all things considered. After all, what was he going to do? Sell the castle, relocate to London, take on a new identity? The thought was absurd. But should he manage to evade me, I was prepared. After all, a deal's a deal, and I was fully ready to track him down and deliver another lesson if need be.